Hi guys, my name's Alex. I'm a senior threat hunter with the team at Countercept, and in today's talk I really want to kind of share my experiences of doing threat hunting at scale with multiple clients, thousands of endpoints, and tons of data really. I also wanted to sort of touch on the differences between threat hunting and traditional security, how they differ, why they differ, or do they differ at all, I guess. I also wanted to share some tips for how attackers can up their game. You know, it's a bit of a free rein at the moment. Attackers think the dog's bollocks, but there's a lot of things they can actually do to up their game as well and avoid advanced threat detection. Hopefully, by the end of this talk, you'll be able to take away all the stuff I've talked about, go back to your own enterprises, implement it yourselves to actually supercharge your own security teams. Just a quick intro. I said my name's Alex. It's not Ben Davies, contrary to the B-sides brochure, and I'm a senior threat hunter with the team at Countercept. I spend my days doing sort of investigation, actually hands-on, getting into the data, pulling files, analyzing memory dumps, and liaising with our clients to remediate any issues. The other big part of what I do is attack research, understanding what attackers are currently doing here and now in real environments, and making sure that we can actually detect that at Countercept, making sure that's in our workflow. I've also got a background as a pen tester. I actually used to work at MWR as a regular pen tester before joining Countercept. And previous to that, I was doing sort of more standard corporate security and security monitoring. Bug bounty fan, massively always encourage people to participate. And also a wannabe blogger, I guess, and Twitter fan, feel free to follow. So my journey into threat hunting actually started about 3 years ago. I was working in a fairly sort of typical security team. We had all the usual products, McAfee, the endpoint agent, HIPS, IPS, we have firewalls, email analysis, all the standard stuff that most enterprises have. But even with all those products, I didn't have access to raw data. And working in the security team, knowing what attackers were doing, they were spinning up processes. They were installing persistence on our network. And I had no way to see any of that with the current tools I had. So I actually ended up writing a blog, or writing a bit of PowerShell, which I put on my blog later. And all this PowerShell did was it went out to the estate and it would just pull back data. And so I actually ran this across thousands of endpoints, pulled back all this data, did least frequency analysis on it, and actually found some interesting things. I kicked off some investigations because of it. And at the time, I just thought, hey, I'm just collecting data, I'm doing analysis, I'm finding the bad guys. But I never kind of realized in my head that this was fundamentally a sort of a different approach to security. It was being proactive. I wasn't relying on some product to give me some alert to tell me, hey, there's a bad guy over here. I was the one actually doing that. And it's funny, fast forward 3 years to where we are present day, and threat hunting and the whole proactive approach to raw data and analysis, that's really taken off, and it's something I do day to day. So what is threat hunting? Well, Squirrel, who are a big threat hunting company, they actually have a quite a nice definition. So it's the process of proactively and iteratively searching through networks to detect and isolate advanced threats that evade existing security solutions. A bit of a mouthful, but the key points really, first of all, proactive. You're not sitting back waiting for the attacker to come to you. You're going to the attacker. You're assuming that you're already compromised, and you're going after them. It's also very human-driven, right? You're not, again, relying on a product. It's about the threat hunters. It's the people in your team who know what attackers are doing, who are actually going after that stuff. The other point I wanted to emphasize here is that threat hunting is focused primarily on detection, and traditionally it was just on detection. But actually that's starting to expand, both into prevention and response, or remediation. And really the power of having all of those components in one agent or one team even is efficiency. As a team, you can see something interesting and actually reach out, collect it, analyze it, and then respond to block it or do something about it. I always feel pain for all those teams out there who don't have access to endpoints and have to maybe call another team, send a request through. 2 weeks later, maybe you get the file back. These kind of processes are just insane. That's just not adequate to really keep up with modern-day attackers. So to put sort of threat hunting in a bit more context, I want to go back to sort of the age-old debate of manual versus automated. And this is quite sort of relevant, I guess, to threat hunting because there's a manual aspect to it. So for the pen testers out there, you've probably used vulnerability scanners before, and they provide awesome value. You can scan at scale, get good quality results very quickly. There's nothing wrong with this approach. I think it's a great approach. However, a lot of you will probably know that in terms of quality, the quality will be less with something like Nessus. You're going to miss things. Whereas if you have manual pen testers, it'll often be a deeper dive into the estate, and you'll find a lot more issues that Nessus, for example, wouldn't find. Flipping this actually on its head and taking this from sort of a more defensive perspective, traditional security teams have had a very product focus. They rely on someone else telling them when something is going wrong. Threat hunting is equivalent to pen testing. You've got a human person who's there on site, looking at data, getting hands-on. And also they're using tooling. So just like a pen tester will use Nmap, for example, to assist them, you can do the same in threat hunting. You can create rules, or you can create automatic analysis to highlight things of interest, or score things to sort of direct your attention. We'd call this, I guess, assisted hunts. Other people call it different things. But in terms of maturity, traditional security teams will tend to be at that far end, focusing on just what a product tells them to do. More advanced security teams will be in the raw data and will be at this far end here, actually doing manual threat hunting. So at Catacept, we developed something that we call the Paris model. And this really describes the way that we do threat hunting. It's a research-driven approach to use case generation. And obviously, we're lucky at MWR, being a security company. We have a dedicated pen testing team. We have a dedicated incident response team. And anything these guys find or do in the wild feeds directly into what we do at Catacept. So we know what attackers are doing as they discover it themselves. And this is really important because you stay current, you stay relevant. And the next part of this model is this top section around automation. You know, obviously automation is a good thing. It speeds things up, makes you more efficient. And when you're competing against an attacker who's also efficient, that's really important. And so, to give a quick example here, you know, if you look at AV, you know, AV would be at the top of this pyramid. High confidence, right? You see a hash, boom, it gets contained, gets dealt with. But say AV sees PowerShell running, what does the AV do? Does it block it? Does it allow it? It's a tricky one, right? And this is kind of where threat hunting comes in. It tackles that world of gray that traditional approaches just can't handle. And so PowerShell would actually be maybe, I don't know, that 40% confidence level. Sometimes it's legitimate, sometimes it's malicious. But having proper rules in place to kind of highlight when it may be interesting to look at or more likely to be suspicious, that allows you to direct your hunting into it. But the key point with this model is it's research-driven. So in terms of just a quick example here, you know, red teams will often use HTA files. You guys have probably seen this before. PowerShell, again, very prevalent. If you were doing a manual hunt for this, you look for MSHTA, you look for PowerShell.exe in-process data here. Also, if you had, for example, PowerShell enhanced login, you can actually look at the log data as well. But over time, you're looking to automate this. You know, have some kind of rule or tagging in place to highlight this activity so you don't need to manually query the data every day. That's just ridiculous, right? Doing it manually. You want to speed it up. And over time, actually add more filtering, get rid of the false positives, and add more context. You know, if you're looking at a persistence entry, you know, say scheduled tasks, well, you've got the name, you've got the path of the file it's loading, you've got the frequency, how often the scheduled task runs. There's all those parameters and that meta around it. And even for the file that it's running, can you auto-submit that to VT, for example, and get other meta there? If you can incorporate this all in a single UI, your threat hunting team will kind of rock it. You know, they'll be far more efficient in what they do. The other two key things here, in general for threat hunting, is the people and the technology. People's a big one. It's a human-driven approach to security. Having smart people who understand attackers, so have OSCPs, have comp sci degrees, have a strong technical grounding is what you need. You don't want just help desk staff who answer tickets. That's not going to cut it, really. And second to that, in terms of technology, you know, having clear endpoint visibility, having visibility across as much of your network as possible is important, just because there's nowhere for attackers to hide. And also having some kind of analysis framework to help you with your analysis. To give another quick example of how we work at Catacept, some of you guys may have seen this. This was the recent Shadow Brokers release. You know, Catacept, we jumped straight on that because we saw the importance of it and actually researched into some of those payloads. You know, double pulsar, you guys might have heard of before, and we produced some tools to help actually detect that. this is what I mean when I sort of say research and modern and current research. This is the kind of stuff that security teams and hunting teams need to be doing to keep up to date. So where do you actually begin? I've talked about quite a few bits here, and you're wondering, where do I start with all this? Well, there's a tendency, I think, for people to sort of almost just jump into the data. Like, if someone gives me data, I just think, awesome, I'm just going to dive in and start finding the bad guys. But you want to kind of almost take a step back there. Define your requirements. What type of attack are you looking for? What threat level? Is it advanced? Is it commodity? Is it an insider? Each of these threat profiles will have different requirements, or even if you've got specific assets that you want to target for monitoring. It's important to define that up front. In terms of use cases, and this is kind of really the driver of your requirements, what do you actually want to look for? MITRE have actually produced a really awesome framework called the Attack Framework, and this covers really the whole kill chain. From start to finish, it has a whole series of different techniques that describe what attackers are doing. And the best thing about this is it's technical. You can click on any one of these entries, you can see a description, a clear description of it, and in that it actually shows what attacks it's previously been used in. It shows you preventative, remediative actions as well. It's a really awesome place to start. And it means you don't have to go away and do all the research yourself, you can just use this. And in our experience, at least, focusing on these real-world attacker activities, it's given us the most value. So what sort of data sources do you want to focus on? So again, we're thinking about how we can actually begin to detect those use cases I previously brought up. There's a tendency, I think, for organizations to work at extremes. Either log in everything, or log in nothing, or log in the wrong thing. And anyone who's tried to do this in real life has probably experienced the kind of frustrations of this. If you go log in a ton of firewall logs, your server's probably not going to like that, and you'll have slow searching, etc. And that doesn't make your security team happy. If you can tune that down and just focus on the things that matter most, that's kind of what you want to do. The other point to mention here is around expectation. If you tell the business that you're collecting a data source, they're expecting that you're monitoring that. In the real world, it's not that simple. Probably 10% of your time is spent logging data, 90% of your time is spent analyzing said data. So it's important to explain that to the various business areas and the C-levels to make sure they understand that analysis is a massive component here, and it's actually really hard to do good analysis. That takes time, it takes maturity. So what's a better way of doing this? Well, I'd say look at the kill chain. Look at how attackers are actually operating here, and look at the data sources that actually apply. These are kind of my favorite data sources. I'm sure you guys will have your own favorites as well. But the key point here really is that you can see endpoint covers this whole middle section. Attackers arrive on endpoints. They move between endpoints and they steal data or make modifications to endpoints. If you don't have this data, you're going to miss a hell of a lot of attacks. And endpoint data is really rich as well. It gives you a lot of context, the host name, the username, when and where process executed or files were dropped or network connections were made. It's a very rich data source in itself. Other data sources like firewall logs, as I said before, are very weighty. They're difficult to work with. They contain very limited information. Knowing just a port and an IP, that's not enough for an investigation. There's no context there. And also, you don't even have the data, like what data was actually sent between those two IPs in that firewall log. Again, you don't have it. So in terms of priorities, you want to focus on the stuff that really matters here. And certainly email analysis, is where the majority of payloads enter organizations. Endpoint, where the majority of activity takes place. And even things like Bro, I love Bro. It's also for network analysis. Definitely those are the things to look at. One last point actually on this slide is just around ease of use. Obviously endpoint stuff, you can deploy out an agent, get coverage very, very quickly. For things like doing Bro log analysis and network analysis in general, you're obviously going to have to deploy kit. And if you've got 50 offices and you need to deploy kit in each of those offices and get a span port set up, that's a massive project. So again, balance efficiency with reward here. Endpoint data you can get very quickly. Network and log stuff can sometimes take a bit longer. So how do you do analysis? Again, this is the phase of threat hunting that is the longest and it's the hardest. I'm not going to kind of beat around the bush here. It's not easy to do. But you need to know how attackers operate. And at a simple level, you can actually just look for for bad things, like known bad things like IOCs. You can look for a hash. Here's a bad hash. Awesome. Kill that machine, whatever. At a more advanced level, you want to look at anomalies. Try and find those unknowns, right? And it's a more powerful technique that's false positive prone. But that's where I think the value is. And with a bit of tuning, you can actually get some good value there. Some people might be a bit angry with me for this slide, but let me explain. So I think there's a whole industry really built around threat intelligence. And IOCs such as domains, IPs, hashes, these get touted as being very powerful, and everyone should be using this information. But the thing about that is that IOCs are good at detecting things that have been seen before. It's a reactive approach. It's not a proactive approach. And it's really dangerous to assume that just because you've seen something once means you'll see it again. Attackers are smarter than that. They change infrastructure. They change hashes. Everyone here probably knows that. So again, why focus on things like IOCs? I'm not saying there's no value. There is some value here. But in particular, things like IPs can be very false positive prone, and you'll spend all your time just basically wading through the false positives, trying to find the real hits. I'd say it's far more effective to focus on anomalies. So TTPs offer a broader approach to detection. They're not as specific, they're not as targeted as IOCs. And this is kind of what a lot of the stuff is covered in the MITRE attack framework stuff, is TTPs. And I kind of just wanted to run through a few examples here. I've divided this up by kind of data. Ideally, in the real world, you don't want to do this. You want to kind of unify all your data sources and have almost one unified interface. But just for sort of simplicity, I've done this. So from an endpoint perspective, there's quite a few things to look for here. So starting off, binaries. They've been the go-to for a long time for attackers. It's old school, right? You just drop a payload and you run it. What's nice about them is they work directly with the Windows API. They don't often spin up additional processes. And in terms of detection, you can look for things like the name, the publisher, the location, entropy, VT score. There's lots of metrics you can use here. Or even use something like ML, kind of the next-gen AV approach to this. But then there's many other techniques. For more stealthy attackers, they think, okay, I'm not going to drop a binary. I'm going to use Windows utilities. I'm going to be really smart and stealthy. The problem with that is that, as a threat hunter, I look for those Windows utilities. I look for them every day, and it's really easy to spot malicious stuff. When you run PowerShell in a malicious way, it's very different to an admin running PowerShell. So it's actually very easy to spot malicious activity involving those. And the same for persistence. Almost all attackers use persistence in some form. There's a few key locations. If you can monitor them, you're probably going to catch the bad guy. A few other points like memory injection, I cover on the next slide, but privilege escalation, UAC bypass. More specific techniques here to bypass existing controls or escalate privileges. These are important things to look for as well. And one other thing I wanted to say up with this was, as well on this slide, was we don't really see more modern techniques. So I don't, for those of you who follow like Subt, for example, he talks a lot about like MS Build, RegASM, all the kind of more cutting edge stuff. We rarely see that in the wild. And if you're an attacker, I strongly recommend using that. It's probably easy to bypass stuff with it, I guess. And also around the permission side, talking about WannaCry, someone mentioned that earlier. Things like ICA, CLS, a trib, as well as VSS admin. These kind of more specific Windows utilities to modify permissions or delete volume shadow copy. It's worth looking out for. On the network side of things, domain information is a big one. You can integrate with third-party services here, so domain tools, passive total. Not cheap, but you can get some good results with it if you've got the cash. But yeah, looking at classification, really, history and the age of the domain, who registered it, a lot of interesting things there. Looking at file analysis stuff on the wire is really nice too. You can look at extension, but obviously attackers can change the extension, so you can also look at content type headers, or even do kind of MIME detection yourself. Again, a lot of this is covered in Bro, actually by default. And any kind of mismatch between those three things. So, you see a JPEG coming down in the extension, but it's actually contained like a PowerShell script. That's obviously malicious, right? You can just make a rule to detect that. The last bit I wanted to mention here, just around logs. Obviously, logs will be dependent on the log type and what the type of analysis you want to do. Windows logs, just briefly, Logins and lockouts, those are key use cases that people will often check for. But even more exotic stuff like DC sync and privilege escalation, dropping a new user in the domain admin group. There's some simple use cases there that can, again, give you some quick value. So I think there's a sort of widely held belief in the security sort of community that if you inject code directly into a running process, no one's going to see you. You're going to bypass antivirus. You're not going to leave any files or forensic artifacts on the system. And it's an awesome technique to use as a bad guy. Now, the reality is that memory anomalies are quite easy to detect from a threat hunting perspective if you have the right tooling in place. And I've listed out some of the common techniques on the left here. You guys have probably all heard of them. These are the kinds of techniques that most of the modern attack frameworks use. Powersploit, Cobalt Strike, Metasploit. They all employ these things. And if you actually start looking at the memory regions associated with these kinds of injections, the anomalies just jump out straight away. You'll be unable to trace back the module associated with those memory pages. Again, it's a massive anomaly. It'll just come back with unknown module. You can also scan that memory region and look for key characteristics like, is there a P header there? Is there an MZ header? And you can wipe these things. You can wipe these things if you want, and some tools do, but you'll still see, for example, an unknown module or a suspicious thread launched within that process. This is just one slide about memory injection. My colleagues Matt and Will at Catacep, they did a whole presentation on this that is way more comprehensive and way more awesome than this one slide. It's at that link below. I'd strongly recommend checking that out if you want to know more about this. So least frequency analysis, or stacking, is one of the mainstays, I guess, of the threat hunting community. Everyone likes talking about this. And this really works from the assumption that attackers will only ever be on one or two boxes in general. And it allows you to spot anomalies. So if you, for example, were to look at run keys across an organization, there'll be the same run keys on a large number of boxes. You've got that, I don't know, what is it, like Java update or whatever. That'll be on like a few thousand boxes. But then maybe if the attacker drops one specific run key for one specific payload on one box, well, that's going to appear at the low end of the scale, and it's going to be anomalous. I pulled some real data just to give you guys a bit of an example here. Highest frequency, counts are really high. This was just process data, and you can see these are just standard Windows processes. There's nothing weird about that. And then you can see at the far end of the scale, there's slightly more interesting stuff. You've got maybe, I think this is like a HP driver, you've got the Intel agent, temporary files, and other weird stuff. I don't know, this might be malicious. And I guess this kind of shows the power of how you can use least frequency analysis. And this is quite a limited view. You want to kind of regard this more as just one metric in your analysis. Obviously, for each of those files, like I said before, there's a location associated with that, a publisher, a VT score, an entropy rating. And that extra context can help you with investigation. Relationship-based analysis, or graph analysis, covers the way that data points are actually related to each other. And this is a classic attacker example here of an attacker running a macro within WinWord and a CMD dropping out of it. If you were looking at parent-process relationships, you'd say, OK, WinWord is the parent, CMD is the child. This is extremely anomalous. And if you look across your estate, you'll be able to see common relationships and uncommon relationships. But don't just limit yourself to WinWord and CMD. Obviously, there's lots more options here, both in terms of payload delivery, so WScript, regserve, RunDLL32, PowerShell, RegAsm, there's tons, and also parent processes as well. Obviously, this is for a macro, but how about if someone delivered a payload through Outlook? Well, then you'd have Outlook as the parent. Or if someone delivered a link and they clicked in it and they went through Chrome to download and execute a payload, well, then you'd have a browser as the parent process. So kind of think about these other options as well. And also, it's not just processes. So think bigger than that. Think about user sessions. How do user sessions relate to each other? Domain admins have very specific profiles that they follow. They log on to a few specific servers, whereas regular users, they just log on to their workstation. If you start doing graphing, looking at how user sessions are used, you'll start to see some interesting relationships. And if those relationships actually change over time, say a domain admin account touches 1,000 workstations, that's pretty anomalous. So yeah, there's other data sets to look at here, network traffic, user sessions. Machine learning is something that's been talked about a lot in the security industry and also the wider, I guess, IT community as well. At Datasets, at least, we use two specific techniques to help us spot anomalies. The first is clustering, which we actually use as a data reduction technique. So if you take process data and you cluster it together based on, say, the arguments, you'll see that very similar things come together, anomalous things kind of come out the side, and that's where you can kind of focus your analysis. Again, it's not the be-all and end-all, but it's just another metric you can add to your kind of series of metrics that you're using. Also, time series anomaly detection is quite interesting. I mentioned sort of user sessions a minute ago. That's one application. Another is around network transfers. And this is actually what you guys can see up on the board here. So this was actually, I think this was downloads. So you can see most people sit at this bottom level here, but aggregating over time and using a kind of baseline approach, you can see there's some anomalies to their usual baselines, and they'll kind of pop out the top here, based on high download volumes. Another approach here is worth just touching on quickly is supervised classification. So you can use that for files, for example. Take 1,000 bad files, take 1,000 good files, train your ML model, build your next-gen AV and whatnot. We actually use this for ransomware protection. That's part of our metrics that we use. There's some other ones we do as well. But if you're sick of hearing about ML and on all the hype, the other thing to do is check out our paper. Though it's on our website. This actually cuts through a lot of the kind of hype in the industry and gets to the point what works and what doesn't work and why. So to be able to do the stuff that I've been talking about so far in a scalable and automated way, you need to think about automation. So I recently watched a movie called The Founder. And this is, for any of you who've not seen it, it's basically the story of McDonald's. And there's an interesting scene in that movie where they go to this tennis court and they get some chalk and they actually draw out the McDonald's kitchen on the ground. And they try and figure out where to actually place everything in the most optimal configuration so they can make burgers in the most optimal way, I guess, or something. This kind of reminded me of how important it is for security teams to be efficient and work together. If you think about McDonald's, they suffered, from having other competition in town. They had to be fast, they had to be efficient, they had to be cost-effective. It's the same for security teams. We're facing attackers who are also fighting efficiency within their own teams. And it's whoever's the fastest, whoever's the most agile, whoever's the most technically competent is going to win. And it's interesting because when you look at less able security teams, they just get stomped on by attackers, because they just aren't able to be fast, efficient, or technically capable. Ideally, I think you want to review your workflow and figure out where your pain points are, from detection all the way to response. What's taking the longest? Why aren't things working? And the more you can speed up, the more awesome research you can start doing, the more capability you can add, and it ends up as a sort of a positive feedback loop. So I wanted to share, I guess, a few more practical tips around automation. I said it before, data analysis using scoring and rules, or assisted hunts. This is really useful. If you see PowerShell running with any kind of suspicious arguments, doing in-memory injection, for example, you want to highlight that up straight away to your team. Again, don't think of it as an alert. Think of it as something that's interesting and worth investigating. It's not as simple as black and white in threat hunting. It's all about scoring and highlighting more interesting things to less interesting things, if that makes sense. Context, again, adding more metrics to your views, making sure your guys can see all the data they need to, and they don't need to maybe click between different systems. I mean, that's again, ridiculous. Get it all in one page, make it easy to use. Prevention response I talked about before. Ticketing's a big one. I think we all hate ticketing, to be blunt. It's very time consuming, but it's kind of a necessary evil, I guess, in security. You have to track incidents. You have to collaborate with people. Using ticketing makes sense. But again, thinking about automation, how can you right-click on something and have that automatically generate a ticket? Or you've seen something new over here, how do you add that to a ticket automatically? Don't force your sort of threat hunting team to have to do everything manually and typing this all out. Payload analysis as well, malware analysis can take a long time in general. Anyway, you can sort of speed that up with things like plugins is really useful. And lastly, bots as well. A really interesting area, bots, and to actually improve communication within the business. This is something that's quite new, but I think it's actually really interesting. It's got a lot of promise going forward in the future. So I'm going to skip ahead a little bit here because I think I'm running a bit late. So I want to talk about a quick insider attack, and this is a real-world example. This is actually something we detected at Countercept. If you look at this, there was actually a binary we saw through least frequency analysis. And this was actually in the startup folder of multiple systems, actually. And we actually traced this back, and we did a wider search across the estate for this file, and found it running on multiple systems. Pulling back the file and analyzing it, it turned out it was a Python keylogger that was spitting out a text file to the local machine. Looking at the timelines, it was quite interesting because we saw it when it was on a few hosts, and then as we were investigating, it actually ended up on more hosts. And we traced this back through the timestamp analysis and found that it started on one host. And it turns out that this one host was the insider who'd foolishly run the payload on his own machine first. So this was, not too difficult an investigation, right? And looking at his box more, we found out he was actually distributing this through advanced IP scanner, which is just a tool that allows you to connect to multiple machines. And we can see the network data, the user session data that tallied all this up. You may wonder, what's the significance of this attack? Well, this guy was actually trying to escalate privileges to target an ATM network to try and steal money. We jumped in there before he was able to do any damage, so this was a big win for us, big win for the client. Imhotep is a strain of commodity malware, and it actually came out, I think, early this year. There was a whole sort of campaign, like email distribution campaign, and this was something we picked up. We saw it being used in the world, and it actually used a macro with this payload here. Picking apart this payload, you can see some pretty obvious things in terms of detection. Hidden window, you think would be really suspicious, but it's actually really common. Admins use it all the time, so it's actually rated a 3 out of 10. So this is kind of based on how severe or important I think it is. Web client download, this is something that's really anomalous. It's definitely something you should be covering if you're looking at PowerShell logs. URLs as well, start process, and actually sort of in general from WinWord, if you see network comms, if you see file writes to specific locations, it can be quite interesting. Obviously, this sample here, it just basically went out to these sites, downloaded a binary and dumped it on the local machine before starting it. But this is way too easy, right? You're all thinking, hey, show me a real example. So, for those who've seen it, Daniel Bohannon, he's got an excellent project on GitHub called Invoke Obfuscation. And this is all about PowerShell obfuscation. And you can turn reasonably easy to read stuff like this into horrible stuff like this. But again, you can do analysis of this and actually spot this quite easily. A few quick points. IEX at the top corner here, great indicator to look for. Strongly recommend it. The bottom part here is decoder stub. These are static and used in this framework. They change slightly. You can just signature this. In terms of this middle section, obviously this is extremely anomalous. You've got all kinds of weird letters, numbers. There's no spaces. You can do kind of ratio analysis to separate this from more legitimate sort of PowerShell. And also length is the other big one. Anything that gets obfuscated grows massively in length. So it's something you can actually use to detect it. So a lot of the stuff I've talked about today has been very sort of threat hunter and defense focused. And for any of you offensive guys in the audience, you may be wondering, how do I do offense better? So I put down a few ideas. I'm just going to kind of quickly run through this. Macros and HTAs. Those are the primary ways right now of delivering payloads. Don't use them, is my advice. Be more creative. Focus on social engineering. Abuse third-party services. Target users directly. Or try to use avenues that won't create, say, endpoint data or easily trackable data. If you go through a third-party service, there's no way, as a threat hunting team, we're going to have those logs. There's no way we can trace that. And also targeting personal assets. It's a gray area, this one, but I'm just telling you as it is, right? That's the reality. A real-world attacker will target personal assets. They'll target the users directly. They won't care if it's corporate or not. They want creds, they want access. So yeah, it's worth thinking about. In terms of execution, avoiding all those things that I've talked about, CMD, PowerShell, all those standard utilities, we look for them. they're really blatantly obvious in terms of the maliciousness. Just don't use them if you can. Often dropping binaries, it can be a better option here, as long as you can bypass AV. And also things like WMI. Again, that can be detected too, but it's just a bit harder or often has less coverage in security teams. The Windows API is a really interesting one as well. If you look at the data stack, from sort of top to bottom, you've got application level stuff at the top. In the middle, you've kind of got process sort of stuff. And then at the bottom, you've kind of got direct Windows API stuff. And if you look at how these data sets sort of stack up, the API stuff is huge. You get so much data if you start monitoring the Windows API, right? So it makes it just not possible to use that data often. Whereas process data is pretty manageable. So as an attacker, if you can compile a binary and use that to access the Windows API, and for example, to do net enumeration, instead of using net.exe, well, you're going to bypass any Windows utilities like rules just by calling the API direct. And this applies in a few different areas. It's something that I'd probably say is a bit under-researched, but yeah, it's something that I'd suggest focusing on. In terms of persistence, don't use the common locations. We all know about them. We know run keys are used. We know service and schedule tasks are used. Don't use them. Be more creative. WMI and COM, again, better options here. Often people don't monitor them. Office templates, Outlook rules. This is the more kind of on vogue. It's the latest cool thing pen testers use. Again, coverage will come for that in the next few months. Right now, though, it's, I'd argue, not very well covered by most security teams. DLL sideloading is something that's taken off quite a lot. A lot of APT groups have started using this, and more nation-state threat actors. It's quite hard to detect. There's not a single location you can query and say, show me all things DLL loaded. You instead have to enumerate all the processes and the DLLs that they have loaded, then do least frequency analysis. And that's a bit more long-winded. In general, if you don't need to use persistence, don't use it. So in terms of exfil, there's a few things here. I touched on it earlier. Using legitimate services as much as possible. Google, Facebook, Twitter, you name it. This came up earlier. Turla, the Russian APT group, they were using, what was it, Britney Spears' Instagram. It's that kind of stuff that's extremely hard for us to detect. We don't have the logs from those services, and often that traffic will be encrypted. It can be quite difficult to detect that kind of stuff. DNS tunneling is another technique that pen testers love and they think is really cool. Again, if you've got the network traffic, it's really easy to detect. I'd say avoid it if possible. But again, it assumes that the defenders have that data. If they don't, maybe you can use that. And lastly, going low and slow. It's the age-old thing. If you take your time as a pen tester, don't be noisy, don't create spikes on graphs, you're probably going to sneak by. So how do you actually do detection yourselves? Obviously, a lot of the stuff I've talked about today is kind of enterprise level, thousands of endpoints, paid for products and stuff. You may be wondering, how do you actually do this if you wanted to go home and tonight and play with this stuff? There's some open source stuff that's free to use, OS Query, GRR, as well as Sysmon. Really love these technologies. Anyone can use them. They're free to deploy. And you can just chuck all that data into Elastic. Again, it's a very scalable technology. It's efficient, easy to use, and it's free. And there's a number of different frameworks you can use. So Etsy produced 411. There's Elastic, which I think was Yelp. Elastic DSL, that's just out of the box, supported by Elastic. So there's a lot of options here. And lastly, infrastructure. You'll notice today I've not talked about infrastructure at all. Underpinning this whole threat hunting operational thing is a massive infrastructure team with hundreds of servers and stuff. That's a whole other talk at a conference, to be honest. But again, thinking about scalability, Puppet Chef, Ansible, Docker, these are the kinds of technologies you want to be thinking about. So I think over the last few years, we've seen a bit of a shift from attackers having almost like free reign over networks to be able to do what they want, compared to now where with the proper detection, the proper prevention in place, it can be quite hard to compromise an organization. But the only way I think defensive teams can continue to be successful is working closely with the red team, doing this kind of purple teaming thing, where you all learn from each other. I learn how to bypass pen testers learn how to bypass me, right? And it kind of helps everyone. And at least in sort of Countercept, a lot of us came from a sort of pen testing backgrounds, right? Me myself, I was a pen tester, and I saw the state of the defensive industry, and I thought, this is awful, man. Like we've got to do better here. And I ended up moving across, and, and now I'm in Countercept doing threat hunting. Because it's funny, I went to InfoSec yesterday, and you look at all the vendors, and you look at these products, and you think, wow, this is a lot of snake oil. Like, do these products really work? I don't know. Maybe some do. But like at Countercept, I guess, we wanted to improve this situation. We knew that with the right data, the right knowledge of attackers, we could improve this entire industry. And you saw, the stuff today, I'm just sharing what we're doing. You don't have to pay for this. It's all there. It's all free. And it's funny because I think if you look at the defensive industries right now, it's pretty much like what pen testing was like back in like 2005 or whatever. We're just starting out. We've just got Nmap or whatever. Like, we don't have all the cool stuff yet. We don't have Powersploit. We're still at the basic level. We're still learning. We're still improving. So I'd say, if anyone in the crowd, is here and you're looking for a challenge, you're looking to define an industry and make the Metasploit, I guess, of the defensive world, now's the time to join. And now's the time to, I guess, make an impact, So yeah, if you're interested to learn more about threat hunting, feel free to grab me after this talk or message me, message Countercept. But yeah, that's pretty much it for me. Thanks for listening, guys.